So hello, everybody. Welcome to our discussion today. I'm so glad you could join us for this important conversation. My name is Tara Mahoney, and I'll be the facilitator for today's session. I'm the Research and Engagement Manager at SFU's Community Engaged Research Initiative, or CERI. I'm also one of the co-authors of the report that we're going to be sharing a bit about today. And so I'm honored that you could all join us for what I'm hoping will be a compelling and motivating discussion. Just a quick agenda. I'm just going to offer some opening remarks, and then we're going to get right into a summary of the report that CERI has just launched covering climate elections, lessons from the British Columbia 2024 election and beyond. Morgan will just give, my colleague and co-author Morgan will give a short summary, and then we'll jump right into the roundtable discussion with our guests to chat about the findings of the report, but mostly how they relate to the current moment that we're in of the federal election and the lack of climate discussion in the public discourse. And then we'll have the audience Q&A, and then we'll wrap up for within the hour. And so just to provide a bit of context, so this event builds on insights from an earlier media analysis project CERI led in 2023 called Quiet Alarm, a review of CBC's climate reporting, which was a community engaged research project that we did in collaboration with the Climate Emergency Unit. And similar to this current project, we coordinated 30 volunteers from across Canada to track climate reporting on flagship CBC News programs over a 2-week period. And the goal of this research was to create evidence and data that of the strengths and weaknesses of CBC's climate reporting, excuse me, in order to make the case for reforms and improvements. After the release of Quiet Alarm in June 2023, it was shared with journalists, producers, CBC executives, climate advocates, and other researchers. And the report and the knowledge mobilization efforts associated with it generated attention from within and outside the CBC, sparking a public dialogue on the role of the public broadcaster in a climate emergency. So after the success of the Quiet Alarm report, we received advice from some journalists and producer colleagues to focus on the election, specifically on election reporting, because in their view, there was a real gap that needed attention. We were also encouraged to look beyond the CBC at privately owned broadcasters, such as Global, which is owned by Chorus Entertainment, and CTV, owned by Bell Media. So that's what we did. We turned our attention to the BC provincial election, which just happened in the fall of 2024. And we intentionally used the BC election as a test case, knowing that we were going to want to mobilize those findings for the provincial election we knew was going to be coming sometime in the spring. And we suspected, and now have the data to support, that what was playing out in BC would likely foreshadow national trends. And anecdotally, it seems we were right. As we watch the 2025 federal election unfold, we see climate change, which is, arguably the defining issue of our time, struggling to break through the media noise. Despite years of record wildfires, flooding, and growing public concern, climate rarely makes it into sustained headlines. Instead, stories are dominated by the economy, affordability, cost of living, and increasingly by the media spectacle across the border, where Donald Trump's return to the presidency is deeply shaping public discourse in Canada with his policies on trade, tariffs, and threats of annexation. This is completely understandable given the threat this faces, but the absence of climate is alarming, especially when we consider the clear connection between issues of the economy and trade and annexation as they relate to climate change. And we're going to get into these questions with our panelists shortly. So I'm now going to hand it over to my colleague, Morgan Krakow, who is the co-author on this report, to unpack our study and explore how journalists, communicators, and citizens can help push the climate back into the spotlight where it belongs. Morgan is a journalist and researcher who has worked for the Washington Post and the Anchorage Daily News and is currently pursuing a master's degree at the SFU School of Communications, focus on climate journalism. Over to you, Morgan.
Thanks so much, Tara, and nice to see everyone here today. So as Tara mentioned, we kicked off this work with a pretty simple question. How is climate change showing up in election news? And we honed that question a bit to think more specifically how our mainstream television and radio programs in BC covering climate change in the context of the 2024 provincial election. So much like Quiet Alarm, we started out by recruiting a group of very dedicated volunteers, I think some of whom are on the call today. So thank you all so much for your work in the fall. They sort of leapt into action and said they were willing to systematically monitor news programming both before and after this provincial election. We figured out which programs we then wanted to have volunteers tune into. We honed the study to include 2 weekday CBC radio programs, including the latter half of the daily news show, the early edition, and the afternoon show on the coast. In addition to that, we added 2 commercial radio shows on the weekdays from the broadcaster CKNW, both the Mike Smith show and the Jazz Joe Hall show. And then we also asked volunteers to tune into 6 p.m. news, broadcast television news from Global News, CTV, and CBC. We selected these 6 shows, which certainly are not an exhaustive list of programming in the province, but we felt this group was largely representative of mainstream news discourse. We also knew that public radio, commercial radio, and nightly news are not a straight apples to apples comparison. Instead, we wanted to see how climate change was emerging during election coverage across these prominent programs in BC. And we chose these shows because of the consistent coverage, the consistent election coverage, and the prominent guests who were showing up on these shows fairly often. So they had a lot of opportunity to center climate conversations throughout the election period. And we wanted to see how often that was happening and if it was happening in any amount of depth. And we also want to note that this study was not intended for peer review, and instead it was meant to be an informal analysis. So just meant to give an on-the-ground view of broadcasts during the election and how climate was factoring into a lot of that coverage. So if you'll recall, the provincial election was in mid-October of last year, and we ran our study across a month-long period from October 7th to November 1st, with volunteers tuning into live broadcasts or when shifts were missed, catching up on recorded versions. We asked volunteers to fill out a survey each time they listened to a broadcast or a portion of a broadcast and pay careful attention to election-specific reporting. And from all those surveys, this is what we found. The vast majority of broadcasts that covered the election, or about 91% of them, so that graphic on the right, did not offer an in-depth discussion of climate change or a climate issue. We found that this absence was most visible in television news coverage, in which only 2% of broadcasts incorporated elections and climate coverage in any depth. And finally, we noticed across our survey data mentions of climate and energy policy issues like liquefied natural gas and the carbon tax often didn't mention climate change during that election segment. So even when broadcasters were covering issues like carbon tax and LNG, climate change wasn't always entering that broadcast or that coverage. So in all, we really found that in-depth climate reporting was mostly left out of election coverage, even though the election was being covered almost every day on each broadcast. We felt like it was being overshadowed by other pertinent election issues like affordability and housing. We saw several moments when climate change could have been asked about or incorporated into a broadcast, from interviews with specific constituencies like young people or business owners, or during candidate interviews, during panels with mayors and Indigenous leaders, analyses of party platforms, and interviews with party leaders and candidates. This finding really underscored this just major takeaway from the report, which is that climate isn't being asked about during election coverage during many of these broadcasts. Similarly, even when more obvious moments to connect climate change and everyday events like extreme weather, climate change wasn't always being mentioned or connected. We also heard some shows, though not all, which is important to note, express or mention a sort of bias towards the fossil fuel economy, focusing more on the economic costs of climate action without addressing the potential for cost savings, long-term environmental and social, and the long-term environmental and social benefits of addressing the climate crisis now. So more broadly, another finding is that some policy issues like the carbon tax just have been increasingly framed less as a climate measure and more in terms of their impact on cost of living and inflation. And so that's something we are hoping to get into in our discussion today as well. Finally, overall, we just didn't hear a lot of public engagement on climate change, despite a lot of interviews with voters. There wasn't much of an ask to the public for their views on climate as voters, which represent a really important segment of elections discussions and perspectives. So in total, this was just one election in one province, but we really intend for some of these findings and some of these takeaways to be more broadly applicable and hopefully add to our discussion of the federal election and other elections going forward. One of the things that I thought was particularly insightful from our study was the volunteer responses. Part of the survey asked whether climate change could or should have been included in the broadcast that they listened to. And we just got a robust amount of feedback on many of the segments that were monitored. So here you can see some of the comments and you can see them in the report as well, but volunteers noted that there were all these other election issues that came up during discussions and coverage, from housing to healthcare, public safety, but oftentimes climate change didn't come up. And the volunteers really noted all the potential connections that could be made between those other election issues and the climate crisis. So people were really noting these absences once they were tuning into it. And just to finish off, I'm going to mention a few of the key takeaways we developed based on some of this data from our report, which hopefully will lead us into the discussion. So the overarching takeaway, like we've mentioned throughout, is just the need to connect climate change with other pressing election issues, which can really run the gamut, but as we've mentioned, can include transportation, housing, jobs, food security, inflation, cost of living, etc. Additionally, we want to highlight the need for asking the climate question to candidates and party leaders, and also highlight that when climate isn't brought up or isn't talked about during a speech, that's important as well. We've underscored the importance of exploring consequences of proposed energy policies, including economic risks and benefits, as well as long-term sustainability and intergenerational climate impacts of such energy policies. We also want to note the baseline importance of connecting the issue of climate change and also extreme weather to what causes it, which is primarily the burning of fossil fuels, as well as the economic costs associated with climate change, which just helps demonstrate how climate change factors into all of our daily lives. And finally, we highlighted this other element in our key takeaways, which I think will be an important element to get into during our discussion today, which is just the importance of deepening capacity in newsrooms to produce more and better climate stories during elections. And I'd be happy to kind of get into that in our discussion. So that is the rest of our study. You can certainly read more of our key takeaways, a bit more about the data and the survey process in the report itself. And I'm happy to take questions on it during the Q&A section. But that is the sort of top line summary.
Thanks so much, Morgan, for that succinct and informative summary. So now we're going to bring in our two esteemed guests who will be in discussion with, I'm going to facilitate a discussion with them and Morgan. So first I'll introduce Kamiar Razavi, who is a veteran journalist and television producer. Most recently, he's worked as an investigative correspondent covering climate, the environment, and energy transition related themes, and currently teaches about the intersection of environmental science and communication. And just told me before the call that he just is launching a new course on fake news, which I thought was very needed and important. Um, our other speaker is Rachel Doran, who is the Executive Director of Clean Energy Canada and brings nearly 20 years of experience in policy, politics, and law to advance clean energy solutions for Canada's sustainable economy. She's a frequent commentator on energy policy, the EV market, and the broader energy transition. Prior to joining Clean Energy Canada, Rachel occupied numerous roles in government, serving most recently as Senior Special Advisor on Climate and the Director of Legal Affairs to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change. So thank you to the three of you for being here. Really excited to jump into this conversation. Um, so my first question is just to everyone, and this was a question Morgan and I that came up for us a lot during the study, was just why? Why doesn't the media cover this issue that is so important to absolutely everybody and intersects with absolutely every issue? So maybe we'll just start there as to what's your take? Like we have some ideas and suspicions, but I'm wondering what you all think. Maybe I'll start with you, Rachel.
Sure. Well, maybe I'd start with a few things that I think might be self-evident to people, and hopefully one that's maybe a bit novel. But, I think one of the challenges around political cycles is that issues that are hard to make snappy promises on, hard to show progress on in a 4-year cycle, like there's less incentive in some ways in trying to make these a central electoral issue from the parties themselves. And I think what we're seeing, and you alluded to in the introduction today, is, people are referring to the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Like people are in an affordability crisis. We're in, a unprecedented time of economic insecurity. And so, those daily issues are crowding out for people, issues that might be more long term, maybe very important and critical, on your to-do list. It doesn't mean the thing you have to do in the next 30 seconds is the most important, but also like it is the thing that is most present in day-to-day life for many, many people. And I think we saw that in polling coming out around the current federal election. Environment came up as the top issue for people in 2021, and now, 3.8% of people are counting it as the top issue. But I think we did some analysis also post-mortem after the BC election this fall, and really want to make a distinction here between the most important issue and an important issue. And I think what we really found there is climate change doesn't need to be perpetually top of mind to be important. Like this is a many decades long crisis, and the consequences are going to be longer. And so climate change cannot be a central issue in the election while still like being, a problem for voters if parties are downplaying this and climate policies being broadly popular. So I think in the conversation we're having today, maybe refuting a bit is partly helpful to say like this is something people do want to hear about, and how are we finding the ways to tell the stories that both hold parties to account and bring a bit of an incentive to raise that as an issue because voters do care about it, even if their top priority might be something that's more day to day.
Mhm. Thank you. Yeah, very insightful. Cam, I'm curious your thoughts on this one.
Yeah, I echo a lot of what Rachel said there. I know that when I was a climate journalist, a dedicated climate journalist, I would often hear from my editors and others that this is not, the story that I was pitching around climate change was not a quote unquote bread and butter issue, which was tremendously frustrating. And so we know that. We know that that's a barrier. We know that a lot of other things are barriers. The fact that climate change feels abstract still to a lot of folks who might not be up to speed on the science, might feel distant still, both in space and time, and a whole host of other barriers. But listen, I would just fast forward to, I guess, the high level point that I'd like to make today, and that I think that you asked the question why. honestly, I've thought about it a lot, and I think it's not. I think it's not a failure of journalism. Obviously, there's some failures of journalism to do the subject justice. I think it's not, as we might assume, a failure of, capitalism that's to blame, that, we're all focused on buying stuff and getting rid of stuff and buying more stuff. It's not a focus. It's not a failure of even like democracy or liberal democracy that we don't talk about climate change. We're talking about the end of the world, the fate of humanity. At the end of the day, I honestly think that it's a failure of politics. It's a failure of being able to imagine things in our political system. It's not even a failure of imagination. I often hear that the inability to cover climate change is a failure of imagination because we just can't imagine what a better world would look like. We as journalists are certainly good at imagining a lot of things. We imagine all sorts of stories around the tariffs and the economy and inflation. And so our job is to imagine ideas and put them forward. So the imagination muscle is there. I really think it's a failure of politics and the political system to move beyond horse race and two-party systems and big ideas. Before this call, we were chatting about perhaps why this was not more of a topic of discussion in the election campaign. And this idea that, Carney might be scared to bring climate up because then he would be attacked as a climate guru or liberal or whatever by Polyev. And so this political system that enables this, to me, is really the ultimate failure. Because, there have been times in our recent history where politicians have been able to think big and big ideas have come through. And so really, I see this as a failure of the political system, of politics, to think big. And I guess that's my high level answer to your question, Tara.
Thank you. I mean, one thing that we came across a lot in the analysis, just to push back on that a little bit, I agree with you. I think that is one of the primary reasons. But one thing we noticed in the study was that, you'd have people speaking with leaders or candidates, they've got them on the show for, say, if it's a radio show, say it's 20 minutes, 25 minutes. The climate wasn't even a question. Like, it's not that they were being asked it and then they said some like throwaway answer or some vague thing. They weren't even being asked. They weren't even being pushed to think, to come up with something. And especially in a context where, the carbon tax was getting scratched and the main question for, folks following it was like, well, what are we going to do instead? That question wasn't being asked. And so I'm wondering, I don't know, Morgan, if you want to jump in or anybody jump in, like it doesn't seem like the journalist, like, is it just that of all the questions you could ask, it's falling so far down the list that it's not worth asking? Or is it that they are, I couldn't figure out how you could not even pose the question in, I think our stat was like an over 80% of the time, they're not even posing the question.
Yeah, well, let me just quickly respond to that before letting my fellow colleagues have a chance. Definitely, there's a failure of journalism to do that work. We are abdicating our duty to tell the truth around the climate crisis by simply not asking the question. There's no doubt about that. But one of the things I've learned working in the mainstream news media for all these years is that I used to think that journalists led the charge, shaped the agenda, sort of were on the vanguard of what's happening in society. And I've come to realize that actually that's not the case, that we follow what's happening in society and then just report on that. So that's why I put the failure of politics ahead of the failure of journalists to do their job. Because I think if we journalists lived in a world, in a society, in a political system where it would be okay to think big, where it would be okay to think beyond the horse race and the dual battles between good and evil, liberal, conservative, whatever as you will. I think if we lived in a world that allowed that, then journalists would, in fact, feel more comfortable, feel more at ease to ask those questions. Right now, we are just defined by the parameters of our society. And as a result, we don't talk about it. You know, we know it's a problem, we just don't talk about it.
I want to let Morgan get your word in, but do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Yeah, I think jumping off of what Cam is talking about and this sort of continued need to just follow and write stories every day. I think speaking as someone who's worked in daily newsrooms, and I don't have a ton of experience directly covering many elections, but I just know how hectic and intense elections can be in newsrooms, and this sense of just needing to cover and cover and cover, it can feel quite overwhelming, even more so than just like a normal day in a newsroom. So I think that can be quite a challenge in my experience, and I have a lot of empathy for folks in those settings, and I've been in those settings where it's just this like onslaught and this kind of, it's hard to necessarily find that through line or spend depth on something, and have the agency to do that within newsrooms, I think, as well, or the ability to do that based on sort of editorial leadership as well. So I think that's an important element, is that what Cam's speaking to is it can just create a real a lack of time.
Yes, I'd love to follow up on two things you said as well, Cam. One of them is this idea of, like, I think journalists, obviously I'm not a journalist, but taught to be kind of impartial, trying to relay two sides of the story. And I think the risk when something like climate change becomes almost a wedge issue between parties, that, asking about it feels like you're taking a side. And I guess one thing I would relay to journalists is, like, this is empirical. We're starting with like where the world is heading. You can start from facts and ask about that rather than having to start from like a position on a certain policy, like a carbon price, which is inevitably going to be politicized one side or another. And I think other countries have a better track record than Canada about trying to create a playing field where everyone's expected to have an approach to the energy transition. It's an economic issue, it's an affordability issue. It's just, what are you going to do? It's not whether it's one side or another. And I think journalists have a role to try to move away from that. So does the public. Like, that probably gets to the next thing, Cam, which I would just say journalists follow, but arguably so are politicians, saying we're just looking at the polls about what people care about. And so we're not going to raise this if nobody cares about it. And the risk then is, not to get conspiracy theorist, but to say the people who have large budgets to start thinking about public relations and how to wield the public narrative then end up helping control, like, what does the public care about, then what do journalists talk about, then what do politicians talk about. So I do think there's a responsibility that should be shared everywhere. And I love that you have all these volunteers in the study who are standing up to kind of ask and support, why aren't people talking about the issues that I care about? And really trying to get both journalists that they listen to as well as politicians they follow to be talking about the issues that they care about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great responses. Um, just kind of picking up on that, like, point about the sort of it's kind of everybody's responsibility, and also like what is the political vision and how does that change and evolve, and kind of back to the framing of the event, which was sort of related to what's happening in the US with, and how the Trump administration's like flood the zone strategy of media relations is like sucking us into that vortex. And so sort of related to all of that, I wanted to ask this topic that Cam kind of brought up as we were planning this event, related to, as the US pulls back from its climate commitments, and there's presumably a lot of opportunity to kind of fill that vacuum and attract like investment to Canada, and also related to the kind of energy transition, and how this is like a very interesting story that will be a long-term story and intersects with the tariffs and intersects with, a lot of the other issues that are unfolding. I'm wondering, like, what are your reflections on this kind of like, I guess I'm sort of thinking about narrative frames at this point, but are we missing an opportunity to explore that, to like communicate that to the public? Because as far as I can tell, I mean, I've seen maybe one or two pieces touching on this, but it is a huge opportunity, and it is an interesting news story, especially as it relates to what is going on down south, which seems to be where everybody's attention is. So I'm wondering what your all reflections are on that. Cam, you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. It's a great question. And I think, as I mentioned in our discussions before this meeting, I feel like right now we're in this period of communicative limbo where none of the political leaders wants to be the first to blink and say something that the other side would attack them on. I was disappointed, for example, when I saw Carney last week talk about energy policy and just reiterate his commitment to the status quo. This is a really ripe opportunity. This is the really ripe moment for us as journalists, as politicians even, to come up with a new narrative of what it means to be Canada Strong, if you will, if I could borrow the name of that group. Because for decades, even centuries, Canada, what it means to be Canadian, has been associated with resource extraction. And we see this, the Edmonton Oilers, it's just so embedded in our psyche. And I think that were it only possible to sort of kickstart the system, the journalistic system, to tell that narrative of what it means to be Canadian, being, developing our solar resources, our wind resources, our hydro resources, as a way of achieving independence and sovereignty from the United States or any other country that we might be dependent upon for imports, exports, energy, whatnot. And to me, so that's a really interesting, good, exciting story that would really do well in this moment of patriotic fervor. It's not happening, and I find that really crushing and really disappointing. And I'm quite frankly at a loss as to how to make it happen, which is why, again, I come back to a failure of political creativity as the sort of overarching reason, because I just wish that someone on the trail, the campaign trail, would bring this up, because then journalists would cover it and we'd be doing stories about it. And so, yes, it's a bit of a chicken and an egg problem. I just wish that we could sort of short circuit the system and get that story out there, because if not now, then when? We're living in this moment where there's a lot of patriotism, and it's just so disappointing to me to just keep doubling down on the old narratives of, will this pipeline get built? Will it not get built? And just totally avoiding conversations around new energy and sovereignty around new energy production. So yeah, you can hear the frustration in my voice. Just one last point also about something Rachel said earlier. I think part of what it means to be a journalist is to see stories through their two sides. This is baked into sort of the psyche of journalists. And I think that needs to change. It's changing slightly in that it's not about two sides. It's not about oil country versus the rest of Canada or liberal versus conservative. It's really about all sides and painting a complete picture of the world. And this is where I feel like renewable energy can fit in. But again, unfortunately, we hear Carney and Poilievre talking endlessly about pipelines and the status quo of energy, and it's just very disappointing to me.
Maybe not from the perspective of an organization trying to engage, I think, the public a little bit in conversations around the energy transition. I mean, I 100% agree with Cam. I would love to see this more of a public debate, but I think we tend to get a little bit like the problem of living next to this economic and cultural behemoth is we were spending so much time looking at the US, even when Trump isn't trying to flood the zone. And we lose I guess, not the ability, but the regular rhythm of looking at what the rest of the world is doing. And so we, in shameless self-promotion, just released a report today looking at Canada's 10 largest non-US export destinations, all of whom have some version of carbon pricing, all of whom have, a net zero commitment, half of whom are looking at carbon border adjustments and regulating electric vehicles. And it's like we get caught in the stories in North America, thinking that because the US is headed in a different direction, that's going to be where the world goes. And I guess one thing I'd like to see a little bit more of is some of that like interest and appetite of journalists in Canada to be really following some of those like factual statistics about what's happening in the rest of the world, because I think it's interesting and it is a real opportunity. And yeah, I think painting some of the stories of the communities and places in Canada where this is growing is something exciting that could be helping paint this as a space that politicians and governments have licensed to be spending time and money and energy on.
Yeah, and just to pick up on that, Rachel and Cam, I think also something we thought a lot about during this report, and something more broadly that I think is important to consider, is who gets a voice in some of these stories, and talking about where these green transitions or these clean energy transitions are already happening, and the people involved in that work is really important to highlight and foreground those voices. I think as a news consumer, hearing from the same either politicians or business owners over and over again, kind of diversifying who we're talking to, ordinary people who are engaged in this work, is really important. I think it shows a level of action that's already been taken within Canada, and can help inspire more of that work, and kind of I think demonstrate the sort of imagination that we're trying to show as already happening. So focusing on those solutions elsewhere, but also I think just talking to folks who are engaged in this here is like of critical importance right now.
Yeah, absolutely, Morgan. And just it's so easy to get depressed and discouraged thinking and talking about this. I know from firsthand experience just how dispiriting it is to work in the newsroom every day and not be able to, and quite frankly, not be allowed to tell the kinds of things, the kinds of stories that we want to tell, we want to daylight. But I would say that the good news is that this work is happening across the country. I was on a conference call yesterday with the Yale program on climate change communication, and they had folks from the city of Boston and Denver talking about some of the initiatives locally there in those two places. And then the week prior, there was another roundtable at Yale with various climate communications or other folks involved in enhancing climate engagement. And it was quite surprising to me to see the range of different activities and work being done, despite what we see from the national government in the United States. So these things are happening. The ball is moving. I just think that you might not spot it if all you're doing is watching mainstream news media. And that's not to downplay the news media at all, because the news media, despite fragmentation and social media, still shape the national conversation in a lot of major ways. But looking at where you live and locally, there is work happening, and there is good things there are good things happening. And so that's sort of where I'm turning my attention to not feel so dispirited about what I see on TV every day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I just wanted to mention, or I just wanted to ask you, Rachel, what was the name of the report that you referenced that you're releasing today?
I will drop it in the chat. Actually, it's called The World Next Door.
Okay, great. Thank you. And Morgan, yeah, to your point, and Cam to some extent, one trend that came up in both of our reports so far is this idea of like sourcing and how important sourcing is to climate journalism, and there's so many interesting climate stories out there, both people who are impacted by it, people who are working on it. And that really shapes the nature of the story, obviously. So one thing we wanted to work on after this report was kind of like a crowdsourced list of potential climate sources. So people aren't kind of drawing on the same old people who say the same old things, and kind of diversifying that to some extent. We're about to jump into the Q&A, but I just wanted to ask Rachel a question, because on that point about sourcing, what is a question you wish journalists asked you more often when covering climate or the energy transition?
I think what's the cost of the status quo was a good one that got listed earlier. I think we're often having these conversations about the cost of something, and it was, illustrated in your report recommendations without talking about the other alternatives or the context. And so I think that's a really important one for us to be talking about. And I guess the other thing I would say to journalists is like, I understand it's really hard to write stories about emissions. They're intangible. It's hard to measure government progress against them. And I think what we're talking about here is it's okay to write a story that's not about climate change, but include it. And so, we do lots of work thinking about household affordability. And it's because, in BC, more people need air conditioners, and why not get a heat pump? It's going to be cheaper and it's going to function as an air conditioner. And just like socializing some of these things that actually fit well within the scope of what people care about in their day-to-day life. But in part, it's about the energy transition. And I guess leaving this idea that it has to be about global emissions or something to be a climate story, it can be about economic competitiveness. It can be about affordability. So yeah, I think finding ways to weave it in, and definitely about the status quo, would be two great things for media to pick up on.
Great recommendation. Thank you. Okay, we're gonna open it up. I noticed there's some questions in the chat that have been posed. I'm gonna call on my colleague Joanna in a second to maybe pull one of those questions from the chat. And then meanwhile, if folks want to pose a question verbally, please just put your hand up and we'll call on you as we can. So Joanna, do you have a question for us?
Hi, everyone. Yes, there's a question from Simmer, and he's asking, or she, or they are asking, how are journalists trying to look into narrative frames, and how can you engage with people and use them to massage these messages into conversation?
Sure, I can take that one on. I think one of the things that we as journalists have to move away from is relying so much on elite sources as the purveyors of truth in our storytelling. Both Rachel, both Rachel, Tara, and I think Morgan also touched on this, that when you're trying to tell stories about climate change or any other subject for that matter, you want to hear, and you want to not just hear, but foreground the perspectives of people who have actual experiences, lived experiences, personal viewpoints to share, and use those voices, those frames to actually ground your storytelling. So not just using them as sort of streeter style quotes or clips to lend color to the story, but to actually drive the narrative. So for example, if a neighborhood is involved in a project to daylight a river, for example, the narrative frame would be centered around the work that the residents are doing, and ideally in the face of some kind of challenge or some kind of villain. And so that takes the narrative frame of climate away from the sort of elite perspective and brings it to ground level. It's more visual, it's more interesting, it's more narrative driven. And so this is how I would, I suppose, train the next generation of journalists to look at stories. Because when I was learning how to do this work, I remember certainly learning that, the primary sources of a news story had to be those with a kind of expertise. And that's important too, don't get me wrong. But I think, especially with a story like climate change that we're trying to redefine, that we're trying to mold into something interesting and watchable, I think the focus has to be on those folks, on those sources who have on the ground, nose to the ground lived experience.
Thank you for that.
Oh, I was just gonna echo Cam's sentiment and just note there's a real, I think, richness that comes from doing that work and talking to those folks and having someone who will walk you around their neighborhood or sit with you for an afternoon and talk about their experience and the importance of showing that they are an expert in a story about their community. I think it just really helps to tell a really interesting and compelling story with so much sort of richness and depth instead of just talking to sort of those elite sources. So I think it does a lot to help with just an interesting sort of well-told story as well.
Mhm.
Yeah, and also, I mean, this is what reporters are good at, whether it's climate or crime or whatever the story may be. Journalists are the perfect people to go out and daylight people's stories. I mean, we're storytellers. We're good at sitting down. We're terrible at telling our own story, but we're great at telling other people's stories. And so that's what it's about at the end of the day. So why not stories around climate, environment, ecological restoration? Yeah.
Mhm. Omri, I see you have your hand up. Feel free to pose your question.
Hi, folks. Thanks so much for the talk and for all the research. It's really nice to see stuff sort of posed as clearly as it is, and to have this hindsight, this recent hindsight of the BC election to look at as an example of how we could do things differently. I'm also a recent graduate of the SFU School of Communication, and I was involved in a Siri project also about the BC election, looking at affordability and climate change and how to sort of take that narrative and use the affordability conversation, which gets a lot of media play, to bring it into issues of climate change and these sort of broader structural problems. I think there's a wall that we've all been hitting, and it's twofold. One is Post Media, which is now run by a hedge fund, like an American hedge fund, which actually contravenes Canadian law, but that hasn't been openly discussed. It owns around 2/3 of Canadian papers, and they have a very specific bent. You know, the work that Conrad Black did around 20 years ago to consolidate media is really showing us why it's so important for the government to intervene. And speaking of which, the other one is that we're engaged in a national experiment when it comes to Facebook or Meta and their total exclusion of any Canadian media from their platforms, which are the most used in the country. And so I guess I just wanted to ask the speakers if you have any opinions or I guess, thoughts about how we can kind of circumnavigate these roadblocks of media consolidation, both in terms of social and conventional media, to get the message out.
You can see no one's jumping to answer the question. That's a good one, Omri. I mean, I think in our organization, we're definitely trying to think through different messengers for this kind of thing. Like, definitely traditional media has a role. There's certain audiences that are going to be reached on Facebook. There's different ones, you know, if you're still on Twitter versus Blue Sky. We've definitely tried to cultivate, though, as well, a bit of like trusted messengers. And so how are we as individuals talking to our communities, and how are local governments talking to the people they're engaging with, and trying to just provide resources? And we provide these to media who may, you know, not have the time to fact check everything, like what's a myths and facts kind of about the energy transition, but also to someone like your local person who you might encounter in a municipal office. So I don't have the answer, but I think part of what we're trying to do is think about the diversity of ways that people get messages these days, and how can we access that. I think, you know, we've certainly watched studies in right-wing politics in the US, seeing like that there's a lot of success in consolidating around certain like podcasts and other figures. So I think we're still trying to figure out what are the avenues to reach people about messages like this. And I think it's a topic we should keep exchanging about.
Yeah, Omri, I think it's such a good question. We talk about food deserts. Now we have news deserts and corporate ownership, news swamps, as it were. Well, one strategy is to flood the zone. So you put it out there on multiple platforms. Another one is to support independent media. But I think I think beyond the media lens, the way to get around this is threefold. First, engaging the public as much as possible locally. So resident groups, community associations, public libraries, any sort of local initiative, nature walks, to get the public thinking and concerned about this. Like I said, this work is happening on a local scale in cities and towns across the country. Promoting more of that. Number two, civics education is so important, starting early on, so that students understand the role of social media and corporate media and consolidation. So that's also happening. And then the third piece that I don't think is happening to as great an extent is rethinking science education from the early grades. Getting kids to think empirically, but also creatively, place-based education, integrating humanities arts with science, selfless plug. I mean, this is kind of the work of science communication, is to bridge those two things together. And I think this could be done from starting in elementary school. And so I do see some educators moving in that direction, but nowhere near the scale that needs to happen. Yeah, so those are sort of my interventions.
Yeah, I think I'd just echo what Cam said about supporting independent media. I think a lot of the type of storytelling and journalism that we've been discussing as a model is already happening at a lot of independent media here. And I think just continuing to support some of those outlets is quite important as well.
Yeah, because if anyone's going to paint the vision of a different kind of Canada, it's going to be the independent media. It's not going to be the US hedge fund owned Post media. It's not going to be the corporate media, unfortunately. It's going to be the independent media. And so they could use all the support they can get.
Mhm. Thank you. Thank you for your question, Omri. We have time for one more. I'm gonna get reference Sandra Langley here in the Q&A. Should you up the emphasis on the straightforward wrongness of lies and political power? So, Sandra, feel free to chime in here if I'm not getting it right, but I feel like this is kind of about when political leaders themselves and or narratives that are out there are just wrong. They're wrong about the science, they're wrong about climate change, and they're perpetuating those lies or sometimes misunderstandings, and making things opaque and deliberately confusing people. So what do we do about that? And this will be our last question, and then we'll wrap up.
I don't know if my volume level is okay on your side, is it?
Yeah,
No?
we can hear you.
Okay. Well, for example, why not ask questions that are really blunt instruments like why would you, well, you could ask a conservative politician, you would pretend you believe in science, and yet all your policies put aside science. So why are you lying when you say you're a believer in science? I know that's too blunt, but it's not too far from what I would see as getting under the skin. We're not getting under the skin. It's a new historical moment that we're in. We're not meeting the moment.
Thank you, Sandra. Anyone want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, I can jump in on that one. Thanks for the question, Sandra. I mean, listen, yes, it goes without saying that challenging those who would dismiss the science or frankly just outright lie is imperative. This is central to the to the work of a journalist. And when it comes to climate misinformation and disinformation, it's not happening to the extent that it should. We know that when we set the record straight, it helps move people towards forming correct attitudes, beliefs, and perceptions. This has been tested. And we know that the effect is there and that the effect is a good one. It helps clear up misconceptions, except for the most polarized audiences who are not going to change their views no matter what, but luckily those people are less than 10% of the overall population. So I echo what you're saying, but dare I say that in my view, the bigger challenge is that we as reporters and journalists are just not doing the work that we're supposed to be doing as reporters and telling the truth around the seriousness and impact of climate change. If this was cancer or air pollution or some other kind of threat, we'd be covering it like no tomorrow. So I think that even more important than setting the record straight to those that would lie to us is covering this issue with the vigor and frequency and regularity that it deserves. And that's just not happening. And to me, that is a huge problem, the bigger problem.
Mhm. I think that's a great note to end on. We're at 1:01. So I want to thank Cam, Rachel, and Morgan for being here and for sharing your very insightful comments with us. For those who want a next event to go to, if you feel engaged on this issue and you want to go to something else, we're going to share an event coming up at UBC with Naomi Klein and Seth Klein, who will be in discussion about this topic, this sort of how to frame the future. It's kind of pulling on Naomi Klein's work on the shock doctrine she did over a decade ago, or almost 2 decades now, and Seth Klein with his work and his book on the Good War and how Canada needs to approach climate change in the same way they approached the response to World War II. So that will be a very interesting discussion if you want to tune in, and we shared the link in the chat. And please subscribe to CERI's newsletter if you want to join us in more discussions like this. So I hope everybody enjoys the rest of their day, and we'll hopefully see you again soon. Thanks again to our
Everyone.
panelists.